Today, 28th May 2024, we have further news of more Russian advances in Ukraine and also, incidentally, further news of the crumbling at the edges of the economic war that the West is trying to wage against Russia. But let me first of all begin with the military events, because of course they remain the main driver. I think that I'm gradually coming round to the view that despite the overheated rhetoric we've been getting over the last few weeks and indeed days, including the discussions about authorizing missile strikes against Russia itself, nominally by the Ukrainians, I'm starting to get the sense that maybe wiser counsels, for the moment at least, are prevailing, and there has been a pullback from that disastrous idea. But anyway, let's start with the military developments, and let's actually start with the last topic, because there have been more attempts by Ukraine to conduct drone strikes against Russia's early warning radar network based on the Voronezh radar systems, which there are apparently 10 systems dotted around the vast territory of the Russian Federation, whose primary task is to track the launch of missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles from the United States, and to provide Russia with an early warning system. Now, a couple of days ago, there was a drone attack on a radar station in Armavir. I made the mistake, by the way, in my previous video of saying that this particular radar had been created in the Soviet era. It turns out that that is wrong, that the radar in question is an extremely modern Voronezh radar created by the Russian Federation, though I was absolutely right in saying that it is a modular system, one created for quick repair and, by the way, for rapid dismantling and redeployment should the need for that arise. Well, I've now had or read a rather detailed and rather interesting study of the attack on the radar complex in Armavir, and not to beat about the bush, the conclusion was that the damage was superficial, that the radar, to the extent that it has been put out of operation, would be back in operation within a few days at most, conceivably even within a few hours. Again, it's important to say that these are very big complexes, and almost by definition, a radar complex of this kind, one designed to be part of Russia's early warning radar systems, is going to be a particularly strong and resilient system. It is not going to be a system that is going to be easily damaged or destroyed in such a way as to make it non-operational. By the way, I have also heard, though I don't know this for a fact, that radars are not particularly easy objects to damage and destroy, though, as I said, I heard this some time ago in a completely different context. I don't know whether that is true. People on the threads are very welcome to discuss that and to refute what I've just said. And if they want to send me emails about it, they're welcome to do that also. But anyway, that was the attack on Armavir. Now, yesterday, last night to be precise, another Ukrainian drone apparently attempted to strike at another Voronezh radar system in the, some distance away, actually, from the town of Orsk in Russia's Orenburg region in central Russia, not far from the Kazakh border. Now, the thing to say about this is that for the drone to have been able to travel such a long distance, one of two things needs to have happened. Either it would have operated over this very, very long distance with the help of satellite information provided by the Western powers, which is an alarming and disturbing thought, or, and apparently this is consistent with the type of drone we're talking about, which is a British-Portuguese drone, reconnaissance drone, apparently, which the Ukrainians apparently have adapted for strike purposes. Anyway, apparently this drone takes off vertically. So it is not impossible, in fact I'm going to suggest that it is highly likely that this attack was carried out by a reconnaissance group, a sabotage group, inserted into Russia by Ukraine, which is tasked with assisting in this offensive against these radar complexes. Now, a satellite picture has been published purporting to show the damage to this radar complex. I'm going to say straight away that I am not able to make any sense of this radar picture at all. In the past, people have made many claims based on dark areas in radar, in satellite photos, and it's turned out that those photos, those dark areas, were purely the result of light anomalies. A good example, by the way, was the Israeli attack purportedly on a Iranian missile base near to the, well, actually some distance from the Natanz uranium enrichment complex in Iran. Again, I thought that the satellite photos that I was shown, that were circulating, showed actual damage to this complex. It was subsequently pointed out that what the satellites showed was simply, as I said, shaded anomalies, light anomalies. So I am not going to try to second guess what level of damage was done by this drone to the extent that it might have even struck this radar complex at all. But I'm going to make a guess that, again, the damage done by what would have been a small drone would have been relatively superficial. Now, all of these attacks, every one of these attacks, bears the hallmarks of Kirill Budanov. This is exactly the kind of thing that he does. He's tried, as we have seen, to launch all kinds of James Bondian operations in all sorts of places, landing reconnaissance parties onto Crimea, where in many cases, well, in one case in particular that I can remember, they were caught by the Russians and mostly killed. He's also carried out all kinds of attacks in all sorts of places. At one time, he was sending teams of assassins to try to murder officials of the various Russian-appointed governments in the Donbass and in Zaporozhye and Kherson region. We're hearing very little about that now, which suggests to me that the Russians have managed to infiltrate and break the networks that Budanov created. And of course, he's done other things. He's sent incursions into Russian territory in Belgorod region, reactivating action by the Russians in that precise area of Ukraine, Belgorod and Kharkov region, which has led to an overextension crisis on the part of the Ukrainian military and has proved disastrous for Ukraine. But Budanov is never a person to learn any lessons from this kind of thing. James Bond operations remain his hallmark. He sees these big, important radar systems, and of course, he cannot resist attacking them. And undoubtedly, Budanov has his backers in the West, in the Western intelligence communities. The Russians appear to believe that most of his sponsors are British, and of course the fact that the drones used in these operations are British Portuguese drones. By the way, I ought to say in parenthesis that Britain and Portugal are very long-standing historic allies. In fact, the British have in the past spoken of Portugal as their oldest ally in Europe, just saying. Anyway, the fact that these drones that have been used have a British origin, undoubtedly that's going to reinforce the belief, true or not, that the Russians have that the British are involved in these operations and that they're working alongside Budanov to carry them out. Now, these operations, these attacks on these radar stations, as I said, are incredibly provocative. In fact, they're off the scale provocative, attacking Russia's early warning radar system in this kind of way. And they do give us a good idea of the sort of targets Budanov, at least, would want to see attacked if the Ukrainians were indeed given permission to use their cruise missiles to launch strikes on Russian territory. The Ukrainians are trying to claim that the reason they want permission to attack Russian territory is because they want to launch strikes against the Russian military units which are deploying on their border and crossing into Kharkov region. That is, of course, complete nonsense. The Ukrainians have been launching missile and rocket and artillery strikes and, by the way, drone attacks against these Russian units on Russian territory throughout the time of the Kharkov operation and, by the way, before. And as we have seen, the Ukrainians have also sent units trying to attack Russian positions in Belgorod and Kursk regions, the operations masterminded by Budanov, which have provoked this Russian reaction. And of course, the Ukrainians have used Western artillery systems or NATO-supplied artillery systems like the Czech Vampire multiple launch rocket systems already in those attacks. This is a threadbare excuse. It has no reality behind it. What the Ukrainians actually want to do, what their Western backers want them to be able to do, is to launch cruise missile strikes on facilities, energy facilities, possibly nuclear power plants, possibly also radar stations and other advanced facilities inside Russia, using Western cruise missiles, missiles that would be able to do far more damage than these drone attacks can do. Now, that also, by the way, reinforces my belief that the likely way in which these operations are being conducted are by sabotage groups that Budanov has infiltrated into Russia. And again, people will argue about this, they will push back on this, they will also say that the Russians, if that is indeed the case, that their security services have failed in some fashion, which of course, strictly speaking, would be true. But it's important also to remember what an enormous challenge it is, or would be, for the Russians to detect every single Ukrainian infiltrating group that exists over their colossal territory. Russia, of course, is by far the biggest country in the world. It has by far the longest border. It is relatively easy to cross the border in some places, especially, I suspect, in Central Asia, and it's impossible to police the border rigorously. It would require the kind of steps the Soviet Union once undertook in order to close the border in that kind of way. And of course, beyond that, there's now a very large refugee population of Ukrainians inside Russia itself, people who have fled to Russia to escape the war. It's likely that there are infiltrators amongst them. And last but not least, as the various assassinations that Budanov organized in Russia itself and in the four territories shows, there are people both in Russia and perhaps still more in the four territories who are supportive of Ukraine and who are hostile to the Putin government and who would side with Ukraine in this conflict, and some of them probably are willing to participate in operations of this kind. So yes, the Russians, obviously, if this is what is really going on, need to get a tighter grip, but it is not entirely surprising that this kind of thing has happened. Let me repeat again, these drones cannot do significant damage to these huge and undoubtedly heavily hardened complexes. And I am sure that the damage done to the radar complex in Armavir is every bit as superficial as that report which I read suggests about the damage done by the attack on the radar station near Orsk. Well, about that I cannot speak. As I said, I'm not able to assess this satellite picture. But again, I doubt that it has done as much damage as some people are suggesting. I noticed that the military summary channel spoke about these radar stations as having been destroyed. That is certainly not the case. Even I, who have no background in examining photographs, can see that the radar station at Armavir is far from destroyed and certainly can be repaired. The only question is how quickly that can be done. And given the nature of the radar, I would certainly think that it can be done very quickly. Now, the best evidence that the damage on these radar stations is superficial comes from the Russians, and not from any statements that the Russians have made, of which there have been none, by the way. The Russian government has said absolutely nothing about this, nor has the Russian Ministry of Defense. It is from the general deportment and activities of Russian officials. There is not a whiff of alarm or panic evident as a result of these attacks. All Russian officials appear to be conducting their business in exactly the same way as they have always done. Putin himself is currently in Uzbekistan. There is no sign that these attacks are disrupting his visit to Uzbekistan in any way. All other Russian officials and ministers seem to be carrying on with their business as normal, and Russian military operations in the conflict zone also continue as normal. Now, no doubt, the word has gone out across the Russian system that there is to be silence about these attacks on these radar stations, and people are to continue to work as normal. There's that famous British expression going back to World War II, stay calm and carry on, and that seems to be the watchword in Moscow at the moment. But I still believe that if there had been real significant damage to Russia's early warning system, damage that really had compromised that system to any degree, we would be seeing much more of a reaction than we are seeing. We would see signs that meetings had been cancelled, that officials had been hurriedly brought together. There would be signs that the Security Council in Moscow had convened, and it's likely that Putin himself would have returned to Moscow. None of that is taking place, and that suggests to me that these pinprick attacks have done little damage, and that the Russians, for the moment at least, feel able to brush them off. Let me repeat again. If Western cruise missiles are used to conduct attacks on facilities of this kind, radar stations like the ones in Armavir and Orsk, or nuclear power stations inside Russia, then that is an entirely different matter. That is an escalation on a completely different scale. Now, on that point, a number of people have pointed out to me that these cruise missiles that we've been talking about, the ATACMS, the Taurus, the Storm Shadow, have relatively limited range. The Storm Shadow has a range of about 250 to 300 kilometers, as I understand it. The ATACMS has a range of also of around 300 kilometers. There's some doubt about how great the range of the Taurus missile is, but perhaps 500 to 800 kilometers. That still covers a significant part of Western Russia. It would still be, all of these missiles, I think, if they were launched on the right locations, could probably reach the radar in Armavir, for example. But none of them would be able to reach Orsk. But having said that, there are any number of important targets in Western Russia close to these radar stations. If Budanov and Zelensky were ever given the green light to launch their missiles, their ATACMS and their Taurus and their Storm Shadows on Russian targets, I have no doubt that they could find a handsome selection of these high-value, very sensitive, important targets that they would be able to strike at. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the attack on the radar facilities. For the moment, this is another one of those minor strikes that Budanov carries out, whose effect is more performative than anything else. But obviously, if he's given cruise missiles to work with, then the whole situation changes and becomes far more dangerous. Now, on that topic, there's apparently a NATO meeting today, but I understand that there is now mounting pushback against this idea. Germany, Italy, and Spain have all of them separately made clear their opposition to this idea, and I understand that the discussion that's been taking place within the Biden administration, no doubt after urgent warnings from the Pentagon, has also decided against granting Ukraine this sort of permission. What the British and the French are saying about that, I know nothing. So it looks as if, for the moment, this disastrous idea has been shelved. That doesn't mean it might not be revived at some later date. Quite possibly it will. And of course, it's possible that when we get the results of the NATO meeting, we will discover that something has been consented to and agreed, in which case, as I said, that will be a cause for serious alarm. But anyway, for the moment, it looks as if warnings, undoubtedly warnings from Moscow, but I suspect also warnings from the military people within the West itself, are having some kind of restraining effect, and it looks as if some Western governments are pushing back hard against this whole plan. For the record, I'm starting to get the sense also that the Meloni government in Italy, which had been initially very supportive of Project Ukraine, as the military situation on the battlefronts starts to shift, is now cooling on the whole idea. They seem to be dragging their feet on supplying Ukraine with more weapons. Apparently, they've refused to provide more air defense weapons. In fact, that seems to be the general story across Europe. There was a report, I believe, in Bloomberg, which said that Chancellor Scholz's attempts to get other European states to sacrifice their air defense assets by providing them to Ukraine has fallen flat. European states are refusing to do so. They're saying that their air defense has already been severely compromised already by the number of deliveries of air defense systems to Ukraine, and that they are not willing to supply any more. Italy apparently is one of the objectors, and Greece quite publicly has been one of the others. And Greece also has apparently now come out and said that it is not prepared even to provide Ukraine with security guarantees. All of which suggests that maybe all this overblown rhetoric about deploying troops to Ukraine, of green-lighting missile strikes on Russia, all of this dangerous rhetoric is now starting to fuel alarm in Europe, if so, not before time, by the way, and that we're starting to see the first signs that some European countries, which up to now have been loyal water carriers for the entire Ukraine project, are now showing signs of rebelling and even backtracking. Anyway, I want to stress the NATO meeting is happening today. We don't yet know what the outcome is going to be. Let's wait and see. But for the moment, the indicators are that this particular idea is going to be kicked into the long grass. I hope so, and I should say, I hope that the fact that that is the outcome I want to see isn't to some extent shaping my expectations of this meeting. But anyway, overall, that is my impression. On other points here, let's also say that there seems to be a general reduction, a continued reduction rather, in military supplies to Ukraine. Germany apparently has now come forward. Chancellor Scholz has said that Germany has now reached its absolute limit in terms of the military aid it can supply to Ukraine. It simply doesn't have any more weapons that it can provide. And I noticed that Belgium has signed all kinds of security and arms supply agreements with Ukraine, and this includes delivery of 30 F-16 fighter jets, but I noticed that the timescale for their supply is said to be 2028, in other words, 4 years from now. So that doesn't look like Belgium currently rushing to supply more weapons to Ukraine at this particular point in time. Anyway, enough of all of this. Let's now turn to the actual situation on the battlefronts. And, well, I'm going to say that it's more of the same, which is to say more Russian advances in all sorts of places, Ukraine clearly on the defensive everywhere, and importantly, I'm coming round to the view that despite all of these reinforcements that have been rushed to the Kharkov front, even there, despite some suggestions that the Ukrainians, in terms of manpower, now outnumber the Russians on the Ukrainian front, on the Kharkov front, by a ratio of 3 to 1, which would be remarkable if true, that anyway, that the Ukrainians are in fact still losing ground. There's been a lot of information from Volchansk, far less from Lipsy at the moment, but the information from Volchansk, which includes satellite, apparently films and photographs, appears to confirm that the Russians are indeed advancing. They seem to have systematically destroyed all of the bridges and crossing points in the Volcha River to northern Volchansk, which, by the way, reinforces my belief that the Ukrainian troops who are still in northern Volchansk are actually cut off, and that the delight that some people on the Ukrainian side had at the discovery that there are Ukrainian troops north of the Volcha River in Volchansk, in northern Volchansk, that delight was misplaced. It rather suggests that a retreat that should have taken place did not take place, and that several hundred, perhaps more, Ukrainian troops, as a result, are in effect cut off from resupply and reinforcement, and are in effect trapped and under siege. Anyway, that's some information from northern Volchansk, and it looks like, as I said, the Russians are gaining more ground, that they're gaining control of these positions that the Ukrainians still control, block by block. I suspect that the Ukrainians remain concentrated specifically in two areas, a area of industrial buildings and also an area of high-rises, and that the Russians, once that they have cleared the Ukrainians from these two territories, they will be in effective control of northern Volchansk, which I believe accounts for something like 70% of Volchansk itself. Anyway, just saying. Some reports claim that there are fire anomalies also in areas south of the Volcha River, which might suggest that the Russians have advanced, presumably from the east into southern Volchansk as well. I'm not sure what to make of these fire anomalies myself. Others with better understanding of this kind of thing than me can perhaps draw their own conclusions, but anyway, I just mention it. And finally, in terms of what the Russians are doing, apparently film and pictures have now appeared of armoured columns moving towards the Kharkov battlefield area from inside Russia. There have been pictures of trains with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. which suggests that with the motorized infantry, the light infantry, which led the initial assaults in Kharkov region, having now established control of what looks like a very large bridgehead in Kharkov region, the Russians now feel that the moment has come to actually send the armoured units, which are the ones which presumably will enlarge the bridgehead and inflict on the Ukrainians the heavy punch. Now, I ought to also say that there are lots of reports still of Russian concentrations in the Sumy area. The Ukrainians appear to be very nervous of a Russian operation in the Sumy area. Maybe such an operation is coming, but whatever, for the moment, on the northern front, the fighting continues to be in Kharkov. And I said that the Ukrainians, far from being on the attack, still seem to be on the defensive. That doesn't, of course, exclude the possibility that Ukrainian attacks do take place, but there was a report from one particular brigade, apparently a complete brigade deployed to this area on the Ukrainian side. They're saying that 90% of the men in the brigade are recently mobilized men. By recently mobilized, it seems that means people who have been brought into the army within the last few weeks and even days, and that they have minimal training. And, well, perhaps troops like that can do something on the defense, assuming that they're defending in trenches or in fortified positions, though even that must be very, very terrifying for young men who've not much experience of battle, or indeed older men with no experience of battle. But I can't really imagine untrained soldiers being able to conduct counterattacks and offensive operations against a far more heavily equipped, far more powerful adversary, equipped with artillery and drones and missiles and all that sort of thing. So that might explain why Ukrainian attacks or counterattacks in the Kharkov area have so far, or so it seems to me, largely failed. If all this is correct, then this is very bad news for Ukraine. They've overcommitted forces to the Kharkov front. They've drained the line of contact of some of their best units. If they can't weaken the Russians in the bridgehead, if the Russians are soon going to be in a position to resume the offensive in Kharkov region, this time with armoured forces, if that enables the Russians to capture places like Volchansk and even Lipsy, and who knows, other places too, then what has already been something of a debacle for the Ukrainians in the Kharkov area will, I think, rapidly spiral. Or somebody pointed out, used this word spiral wrongly. Anyway, will rapidly transform into an outright disaster. So that's what I'm going to say about the situation in the Kharkov front for the moment. Elsewhere, the Russians are clearly on the offensive. They're on the offensive in the Kupiansk area. I said that they've managed to capture several villages south of Kupiansk. They're apparently about to attack and presumably storm another rather bigger village in this area east of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. From what I understand, this village opens the way to an attack on a small town, which from memory, I think is called Lezovoy. And apparently if that town is captured, then frankly the entire Ukrainian defense positions on the Oskol and Zherebets River will disintegrate. And the Russians would be able to reach the river and would be able to conduct outflanking advances on the Ukrainians to the north in Kupiansk itself, and presumably also cross the rivers, and move towards places like Liman further south. And, well, there's been apparently more pictures from the Belogorovka area in Lugansk region, and these appear to confirm Russian successes there. They appear to confirm that the Russians are indeed in control of this village in Lugansk region. I've never had any doubt about that myself after the Russian Defense Ministry said so. But anyway, some people have. And it looks as if the Russians are in the process of clearing the chalk quarry or the landfill close to Belogorovka, which many people perhaps mistakenly saw as the key to the control of that particular village. Anyway, the main and most intense fighting continues to be in and around Chasov Yar. And this fighting, as I said in my previous programs, particularly the fighting in the micro district lying to the east of the aqueduct, is of a ferocity, judging from the pictures, that we have not seen in, well, perhaps any fighting in Ukraine that has taken place up to this point. It's clear that the Ukrainians have transferred some of their very best and most highly motivated troops to the micro district. To me, that looks like a strange decision, given that as the micro district lies east of the aqueduct, I would have thought it was obvious that the Russians would be able to trap those troops there. But anyway, that is, for whatever reason, what the Ukrainians appear to have done. Now, there's a lot of discussion and argument about who controls what part of the micro district and whether the Russians control just a few buildings or larger areas of the micro district. I'm not in any position to say. Again, how can I? But all I will say is the fighting is ferocious, the shelling is ferocious, there are Russian tanks operating inside the micro district itself, and from what I can see, by the way, they're able to operate without too much risk of destruction. With the Ukrainian troops in the micro district, in effect surrounded and unable to get reinforcement or resupply, it is only a question of time, however bitter the resistance there is, before the micro district eventually falls. Now, on the northern flanks, we've been getting more reports that the Russians are in Kalinivka, this village to the northeast of Chasov Yar, and that they're clearing the forest areas around there. And, well, perhaps they haven't yet reached the aqueduct in the northern part, on the northern flanks, as some people had reported, but it does look as if they're likely to before very long. And on the southern flanks of Chasov Yar, we're not only getting reports that the Russians are advancing in the fields west of Kleshevka and Andreevka and south of Ivanivska, all of these villages that the Russians have recently captured, but we are getting reports now that at least one Ukrainian brigade that was fighting in this particular area has been effectively destroyed. Its loss rate is apparently off the scale. I'm not sure what the percentage is, but it is apparently absolutely off the scale. And Ukrainian commentators, apparently, or pro-Ukrainian commentators, are talking about the extraordinary courage of the men of this brigade, which is indisputable, but of the fact that this brigade, in its existing form, has been completely destroyed and is no longer capable of conducting military operations. So this is the price that Ukraine is paying for the defense of Klashayevka and Andreevka. Never made much sense to me. 2 villages have been captured by the Russians, but one of Ukraine's brigades in the process has been destroyed. Maybe Ukraine should have withdrawn from those 2 villages sooner and withdrawn back to the aqueduct and created proper defense lines to the west of the aqueduct, rather than try to hold on to positions in those 2 villages, these 2 tiny villages, which they defended at such horrific and pointless cost. Now, since I'm talking about cost, I saw that there was a commentary by a Western journalist who straightforwardly said that Ukraine is lying about its losses. That is indisputably true. He's not saying anything that hasn't been obvious, at least to me, for a very long time. But perhaps more interesting still was comments which I've seen attributed to General Cavoli, who is NATO, the military commander of NATO forces in Europe. He's an American general. Now, I haven't seen the actual text of this, so I'm taking this at second hand, but I believe that General Cavoli did actually say this. And it seems that General Cavoli is now saying that a lot of the footage that Ukraine has been releasing of appearing to show the effectiveness of its FPV drones is exaggerated. The actual damage done by these drones is less than the footage might imply. And I suspect this is true. The Ukrainians regularly publish pictures of FPV drones attacking Russian armored vehicles. Often we see smoke and things like that coming from these vehicles. It is taken for granted by many people that that means that these vehicles have been destroyed. I have always wondered about this. I've also often wondered about the claims that the FPV drone attacks that the Ukrainians undertake have inflicted quite the level of losses on Russian units that they sometimes claim. If what General Cavoli says is true, assuming, of course, that he did indeed say it, which I'm sure he did, then that tends to confirm my own assumption that the Ukrainians are overstating the damage that their drones are doing to the Russians. What is indisputable, however, is the appalling damage and the horrific casualties that the Russians are inflicting on the Ukrainians with their missiles, their rockets, their artillery, and their bombs. And of course their bombs, their fab bombs, are now an absolute part of the landscape, of the battlefield landscape, along the line of contact. The Russians have apparently expanded still further the launch carriers for some of their bombs and missiles. Apparently, Kharkov 52 helicopter gunships have now started to operate the KH-69 cruise missiles. It's been pointed out that when those cruise missiles were initially designed. They were specifically intended for the Sukhoi 57, fifth generation fighter jet, which, by the way, the Russians say is operating on the battlefronts, though we have had very little information about what exactly it is doing. But anyway, if helicopter gunships are now able to launch these stealthy cruise missiles, then that again tells us that the Russian Air Force is adapting all the time to the changing battlefield conditions and is doing so very fast. Anyway, that's further news, as I said, from the Chasov Yar area. Russians continuing to press the Ukrainians, inflict horrible losses on the Ukrainians in Chasov Yar. And I don't think there's anybody who looks at the situation and objectively and believes that the situation in Chasov Yar can end in any way but one, which is with the Russians eventually capturing the town, at which point, of course, another battle will almost immediately follow for the much bigger town of Konstantinovka, further to the west. And Konstantinovka, relative to Chasov Yar, is in low ground, which makes it far more difficult to defend. And by the way, with Ukrainian troops having suffered such horrific losses trying to defend Chasov Yar, it's difficult to see how the Ukrainians can hold out in Konstantinovka for very long. With whom and with what? Anyway, speaking of Konstantinovka, there was an absolutely fascinating analysis of the fighting in Ocheretino, which appeared in the Russian newspaper Redovka yesterday. And it said that the fighting in Novo-Alexandrovka, which lies to the northwest of Ocheretino, is in fact intended to prepare the way for an advance northeastwards towards Konstantinovka along the highways, the Konstantinovka, which lies west of Chasov Yar, and an encircling maneuver that is intended to trap or force the retreat from Toretsk and New York of the Ukrainian forces that are located in those two places. Now, Redovka explained it in this way, that in order to carry out a proper encircling maneuver of this nature, the Russians need to widen the breakthrough that they have achieved around Ocheretino. They need to flesh it out. They need to capture all these territories and villages, and that includes villages like Letailevo, Umanska, Yasnobrodovka, which they're currently storming, and of course Novo-Alexandrovka, and other villages to the south of Novo-Alexandrovka like Sokol, which reports say that they have just reached. Anyway, that the Russians need to capture all of these places. The point being that they also need to cut the road from Pakrovsk to Konstantinovka, which will provide them with the route to advance along that road towards Konstantinovka. They can then presumably cross the H20 highway to the east of Ocheretino and capture all these villages that exist there, starting with Alexandropil, and also they can build fortified positions to the west of Ocheretino, which will cover the flanks of this maneuver, so that if the Ukrainians do try to counterattack in the Ocheretino area, there are stable defense lines, whilst the maneuver to the northwest towards Konstantinovka is being carried out. Well, I find it the most interesting analysis. Those with a better understanding of warfare than me can say whether or not this is true. I presume that it is. But anyway, suffice to say that the Russians are methodically clearing these villages. They are clearing Novo Alexandrovka. They have captured Netailovo and Umanske. They are apparently now preparing to storm Yasnobrodovka. Even Ukrainian sources are acknowledging this, and one way or the other, it looks as if the Russians are behaving, conducting themselves on the battlefronts in exactly the way that Radovka is saying. If this is the Russian plan, and if it is successfully executed, if there is a link-up of Russian forces from the north and from the south, with Russian troops pushing south from Chasov Yar and perhaps Klashevka, linking up with Russian troops pushing northwards from Ocheretino, and if this link-up happens around Konstantinovka, and Konstantinovka does indeed fall, and Ukrainian troops in Toretsk and New York are either trapped or forced to retreat, then I will say that this will be the most ambitious maneuver carried out by either army over the course of this conflict, and it will be the decisive one. I think this will be the decisive battle. If this whole area collapses, there is really no obstruction for the Russians to move all the way to the Dnieper. Pokrovsk itself in the west would, I think, be in an extremely precarious position indeed. And similarly, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk would also be under extreme threat. And if it is also the case that the Russians, through their Kharkov offensive and their apparent plan to capture Volchansk and their activities in the Kupiansk and Siversk and Liman areas, are intending to regain their positions north of Slavyansk in Izium and all of these other places, then, as I said, you can see how a major crisis for the Ukrainians is beginning to develop, perhaps as soon as autumn, just saying. And of course that leaves out the fighting in the other area, equally important, Krasnogorovka, Kurakhovo, Selidovo, all of these places where the Russians are continuing to fight. There have been reports that the Russians have launched a major advance in Krasnogorovka. As I said, I suspect that the Russians are now intent on clearing Krasnogorovka once and for all. We've had less information from this part of the battlefronts over the last 24 hours, except for picture of a lone Bradley infantry fighting vehicle trundling through Krasnogorovka, through Russian-controlled territory, trying to reach a railway line, occupying that railway line, which the Russians have been using for resupply for a short time. The Bradley was destroyed. I suspect that most of the men inside the Bradley were killed as well. As I said, they're operating well behind Russian lines. It was, to my mind, a completely pointless and reckless maneuver, throwing away the lives of brave men and another Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, of which there are in short supply. I am completely unable to understand the purpose of this pointless act. But the fact that the Ukrainians were so careful to film it from a distance is that yet again it looks to me as if it's intended to give the impression that the Ukrainians are putting up more of a fight in Krasnogorovka than they really are, and that they're able to put the Russians somehow on the defensive in this town. It was, in my opinion, an absurd display. I wonder what the troops in that Bradley were told that they were doing and what would happen to them. I fear that they were not given the full truth about the impossible task that they were given. And we see again how Ukraine is prepared to sacrifice its soldiers, essentially, for propaganda purposes. I would add that the fact that a Bradley was used in this operation is a sign that some units of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, this exhausted brigade, but it's the one that operates the Bradleys, some troops in the 47th Mechanized Brigade have been deployed to Krasnogorovka, with some of them apparently on this lone Bradley used to carry out what to me looks literally like a kamikaze mission. Now, elsewhere, there's been quite a lot of news from the fighting in the Vremivka salient. The Russians now are deploying armoured units in the villages of Staromayorsk and Urozhaine, and they seem to be very much on the advance in these two villages. I've been treating the battle for Staromayorsk and Urozhaine as a sideshow, and I'm beginning to wonder whether I'm right, because the Russians do seem to be committing substantial forces to this area, and I can't imagine that this is not being done for some reason. I suspect that it's all connected to the operations the Russians intend to conduct in southern Donbass, that it's somehow related to the operations in Krasnogorovka and Novomikhailivka and Praraskovivka and all of those places, and Kurachovo. But I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand this fighting, so I'm not going to say anything more about it. Well, that's where we stand, it seems to me, today in this battle. The Geneva conference, I believe it is in Geneva, in Switzerland, is now apparently being written off. It is now widely accepted that it has failed, that it will not achieve the diplomatic outcome that Zelensky and his officials and some people in some Western governments assumed. It seems even President Biden has elected to stay away, and he has given what I have to say is an almost insulting explanation to the organisers of this conference, which is that he intends to participate instead in a donor conference, somehow connected with his election campaign in the United States. I think the Ukrainians and some of the people in Europe and the Swiss must be seething at this explanation. Elsewhere, Mark Episcopos, by the way, one of the most brilliant commentators in the United States about the war, has demolished that article which appeared in, I should say it was not in Foreign Policy, it was in Foreign Affairs, but in Foreign Affairs, and I got the name of the co-author wrong. I refer to him as Ariel Cohen. There is such a person, by the way. It is, in fact, Elliot Cohen. Anyway, that article which suggested that Ukraine can somehow achieve victory if the West goes all in, pulls out all the stops, gives Ukraine everything it needs or wants, and conducts war to the absolute ultimate limit. As Episcopos puts it, the theory of victory presented by Zagorodnyuk is a former Ukrainian defense minister who is co-author of this article along with Elliot Cohen. The theory of victory presented by Zagorodnyuk and Cohen to replace the strategic malaise in which the West finds itself is remarkably even more dangerous and ill-conceived than the status quo. And he then discusses the kind of, I think, well, I'm not going to use the the adjective I was going to use, the bizarre plans that this article outlines. And it makes the point that despite these proposals being presented as new proposals, they are in effect a radicalization of what the West has already been doing. The author's theory of victory is really just a rehash of older policy ideas that are already being pursued by the West, even if not with the intensity that Zagorodnyuk and Cohen would prefer. This is the medieval elite doctor's theory of victory. The problem is not that the underlying treatment doesn't work, proclaims the physician as his patient wheezes and gasps, barely clinging on to life, but that he hasn't used enough leeches. Naturally, all of his colleagues, working as they are, under the same wrong-headed assumptions, agree. And then Episcopos goes on to take the whole idea, everything set out in this extraordinary mishmash of proposals that Elliot Cohen and Zagorodnyuk come up with. He proceeds to take it all apart. And I think he's right. I mean, putting aside the recklessness and danger of what is being proposed, as Episcopos rightly says, it cannot change the general trajectory of the war. Now, I said at the start of the program that we're getting evidence that the sanctions, the economic war, is crumbling. And we've actually had this now in a long article in the Financial Times, which informs us that Western businesses backtrack on their Russia exit plans. That's the title. And the article then goes on to list a whole series of big Western companies and brands which have reconsidered or reversed their plans to pull out of Russia. And the reason they're doing that is because Russia is turning out, is now on the economic rebound. There is a lot of profit to be made there. And pulling out of Russia would be a catastrophic loss. The article goes on to describe some of the extraordinary maneuvers that some companies, like Coca-Cola, for example, are making to try to stay in the market. For example, Coca-Cola announced that it was pulling out of Russia back in 2022, but in fact, Coca-Cola is still being sold in Russia through a company called Coca-Cola Hellenic, in which Coca-Cola itself holds a 21% stake. And there is clearly a decision to stay, also in part to protect their brands. One commentator said, if we pull out of Russia, if we pull out of Russia, they will take our brands for themselves. I don't think that's a good trade. Why the hell should we? And in fact, this is what I've heard. Now, the Financial Times, right at the start of the article, gives numbers for businesses that have remained in Russia and numbers for businesses that have left Russia. And I'm going to say that I don't entirely believe some of these figures, but they do say that more than 2,000 companies have said that they will stay in Russia, that these include consumer groups like Mondelez, Unilever, Nestle and Philip Morris. Other companies like the short seller, the Polish fashion retailer LPP, even though they pretend that they've left Russia, they're really still there. Raiffeisen Bank International is still also in Russia. They sometimes give the impression that they're going, sometimes not. Mostly, it must be said that these companies are in consumer trading rather than in the heavy industrial sectors, where, of course, Western companies, the big Western companies like Siemens, have indeed pulled out, to be replaced, by the way, by Chinese ones or by local Russian heavy industrial manufacturers. But anyway, the Financial Times says 2,100 multinationals have stayed in Russia since 2022, compared to about 1,600 that have left or scaled back operations. Now, when we're done scaled back operations, that means that even amongst that 1,600, some of them, perhaps most of them, in some form, are still there. Now, here I am going to say something which I was told by a Western business person, somebody I've known for a very long time, by the way, and who knows the Russian market, and indeed the Russian consumer market, very well. And this person, and I'm going to be very careful again, so as not to reveal this person's identity, this person has told me that, to this person's knowledge, many of the businesses, especially consumer businesses, which claim to have quit Russia, have in fact engaged in purported fire sales of their products to their local managers, who have carried on the business, sometimes under somewhat modified or different labels, but that there have been private understandings reached by some of these Western businesses, and I've been given a list of some of them, that some of these businesses have actually reached quiet understanding with these managers, that the managers actually are in effect continuing to run those businesses in Russia on behalf of the parent businesses in the West, and that there is apparently an awful lot of this going on. And some major labels, Western labels, have been quietly practicing this. Now, I want to stress, I've had this information from one person. I can't obviously corroborate that information myself. I've not contacted any of the Western businesses that this person mentioned, and obviously I've not contacted any of the Russian managers who are operating the former assets of these businesses in Russia. But for the record, I believe that this is true. Some of the big industrial companies have indeed pulled out of Russia. But one of the reasons why the sanctions proved so unsuccessful right from the outset is that Western businesses, particularly the labels, the ones involved in consumer goods, they were very reluctant to leave an attractive, growing market. They are fully conscious of the duties they owe to their shareholders, and simply complying and quitting such a lucrative market, particularly one which is booming, would be one which some of them probably feel would conflict with their duties to their shareholders. So they've done this rather complicated operation of maintaining their presence there, either through this covert way or more openly, as some other Western business, so many businesses have done. The sanctions have been a complete and dismal failure. They have led to a structural increase in energy costs in Europe. I read a report somewhere that energy costs in Europe are now 84% higher than they would have been if gas and oil from Russia was still being imported into Europe. 84% higher. They have also created enormous complications in the international trading system, which is acting now as a significant drag on the Western, but primarily the European economies. And they have not affected the Russian economy in anything like the same way they were expected to do. On the contrary, I've seen more economic data over the course of the last couple of days, which confirms or appears to confirm that Russia is continuing its industrial surge. Apparently, manufacturing expansion in the first quarter of this year was 8.8%, almost 9%. GDP growth in the first quarter was 5.4%. I've looked at figures for capital investment in April, last month, for which data apparently is still available and which is starting to appear. And from what I can see, capital investment remains at extremely high levels, and corporate lending is continuing to rise at a high rate, which also suggests that capital investment remains strong. In addition, over the last week or so, I've noticed that the ruble has begun to strengthen again. A clear sign that with the general rise in energy prices, the Russian trade balance is strengthening once more, which might have an effect on reducing still further Russia's already very small budget deficit. It is not impossible that we might even end the year with a budget surplus. I have never known an economic policy fail so completely, and it is extremely strange the extent to which this is not being discussed in the West. I have not discussed, and I don't intend to discuss in this program, the absolutely dismal election campaign that is underway in Britain at the present time. Suffice to say that the whole topic of the sanctions war and the economic cost it has exacted is not properly discussed. If Western leaders are really going to turn things around in their economies, then they do need to start to face up to the effect of some of these bad decisions that they have made. Of course, that's only in one area. You could say the same about so many others. But there it is. I am saying it. It needs to be said. Not before time, many would say. But for the moment, that's not something that's happening either. Well, on that topic, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also please check out our shop. You can find all sorts of amazing things there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Last but not least, please remember that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And that if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.